November 22, 1943, Tarawa Atoll, Central Pacific. The tide receded slowly from the coral reef, leaving behind bodies tangled in shattered landing craft and torn packs half buried in seawater. Smoke drifted low across the beach, thick and oily, stinging the eyes and blurring the horizon. The sand was dark with blood. The air roared with distant naval guns and the crack of small arms fire that never seemed to stop. Inside reinforced bunkers overlooking the shoreline, Japanese officers studied the aftermath in silence. The first American assault waves had been devastated. Entire Marine units had been cut down in the water. By every expectation of imperial doctrine, this was the moment an enemy should falter. But instead, new landing craft were already forming offshore. Fresh figures moved toward the reef through fire and surf. Radios carried reports that made no sense to commanders trained to believe that massive losses broke the will of attacking armies. The Americans were advancing again, without pause, without retreat. On the shattered beach, amid wreckage and smoke, Japanese command confronted a reality that defied everything they believed about warfare. The enemy had absorbed the impossible and kept coming. Long before the first U.S. Marines struck Tarawa, Japanese military doctrine had already defined what victory and defeat were supposed to look like. For decades, imperial strategy rested on a central belief. Modern war was ultimately decided by willpower under extreme loss. An enemy that suffered catastrophic casualties in the opening assault would lose momentum, cohesion, and the psychological drive to continue. In Japanese calculations, that hesitation created the moment for decisive counterblows. This belief did not arise in isolation. It was shaped by Japan's experience in earlier conflicts, against China, against Russia, and in the early lightning campaigns of the Pacific War. In 1941 and 1942, Japanese forces shattered Allied defenders across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, with speed, violence, and shock. Garrison after garrison collapsed under sudden pressure. The pattern appeared to confirm everything Japanese planners believed about offensive warfare. By 1943, however, the strategic environment had changed completely. The rapid expansion of the Japanese Empire had overstretched its defensive perimeter across thousands of miles of ocean and island chains. Supply routes became vulnerable, air superiority fractured, ship losses mounted, and, most critically, Japan now faced an industrial enemy whose capacity dwarfed its own. The United States did not fight wars of short exhaustion. It fought wars of replacement. Yet Japanese high command still believed that amphibious assault created a unique psychological vulnerability. Landing forces were exposed. They arrived in waves. They faced prepared defenses. If they were shattered badly enough at the shoreline, Japanese commanders believed the attack would stall or collapse altogether. This assumption shaped the entire defensive system of the Central Pacific. Tarawa embodied that belief. The tiny coral atoll sat astride key Japanese defensive lines guarding the Marshall Islands and the approaches to Japan's inner perimeter. Its main island, Betio, was strengthened with concrete bunkers, coastal guns, and interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese garrison possessed no illusions of evacuation or reinforcement. Their mission was not maneuver, it was annihilation at the shoreline. Japanese planners expected U.S. Marines to suffer horrific losses crossing the reef. They anticipated landing craft would be stranded by tides. They assumed massed machine gun fire would tear apart exposed formations. And once losses reached a breaking point, they believed American morale would falter, buying Japan time across the wider Pacific theater. In their calculations, the ocean itself would serve as a killing field. What Japanese command did not fully account for was the American doctrine of relentless pressure, born not from cultural tradition, but from industrial and organizational reality. U.S. Marine Corps assault doctrine assumed casualties from the outset. It did not treat initial losses as failure. It treated them as the cost of establishing a foothold. The critical objective was not minimizing casualties during landing. It was ensuring continuous reinforcement no matter the cost. This fundamental difference in thinking shaped everything that followed. By late 1943, American naval production had transformed the Pacific theater. Carrier task forces multiplied. Amphibious shipping arrived in staggering numbers. Replacement troops trained at a pace Japan couldn't replicate. For the United States, loss no longer meant depletion. Loss triggered replacement. For Japanese command, this fact remained dangerously underappreciated. They had constructed their confidence around the idea that enemy morale would collapse before enemy material reserves could be fully applied. Their defenses at Tarawa were built to shock the attacker so violently at the shoreline that the assault would pause or unravel. That expectation would soon collide with a form of warfare that absorbed rather than recoiled from catastrophe. As the Japanese garrison at Betio prepared to defend its beaches, they believed they were about to demonstrate the final proof of their doctrine. They believed that the destruction inflicted on the first assault waves would decide the battle. What they did not yet understand was that the battle had only just begun. And as more landing craft turned toward the reef under fire, the stage was set for a realization that would ripple through Japanese command across the entire Pacific War. While Japanese planners built their defenses around the belief that catastrophic losses would break an attacking force, American doctrine evolved in the opposite direction. By 1943, the U.S. Marine Corps had accepted a brutal operational truth. The first waves would always suffer the worst casualties. Instead of seeing that reality as a sign of failure, American planners treated it as the unavoidable cost of gaining access to the battlefield. This acceptance reshaped every element of amphibious warfare. Naval gunfire was intensified to pulverize defenses before the first landing craft ever touched sand. Carrier-based aircraft struck continuously to suppress gun positions and isolate garrisons. Engineers trained specifically to clear obstacles and breach seawalls under fire. Replacement companies drilled to move forward even while the wounded were still being evacuated behind them. The entire system was designed not to prevent loss, but to overwhelm loss with continuity. By the time Tarawa was selected as an invasion target, the United States had already learned harsh lessons from earlier amphibious assaults. Guadalcanal had revealed how easily a foothold could be lost if pressure eased. New Georgia showed how terrain and weather could prolong resistance. Each campaign refined the American ability to land forces quickly, reinforce continuously, and deny the defender any meaningful pause. Tarawa would test that doctrine under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. The coral reef surrounding Betio stretched hundreds of yards from shore. At low tide, landing craft would ground far from the beach, forcing Marines to wade through waist-deep water under direct fire. Japanese artillery officers understood this geography perfectly. Their guns were calibrated to sweep the lagoon. Their machine gun nests overlapped every likely approach lane. The environment itself was turned into a weapon. American intelligence predicted heavy losses. Commanders prepared for it anyway. More than 17,000 Marines were committed to the assault, supported by an overwhelming armada of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers. Naval bombardment was scheduled with precision. Carrier strike groups rotated continuously to keep pressure on Japanese positions. Unlike earlier Pacific engagements, this operation was built not around surprise, but around the certainty that the enemy was waiting. This shift in approach reflected a larger transformation taking place across the American war effort. By late 1943, U.S. industry had reached full wartime output. Shipyards launched vessels faster than Japan could sink them. Training depots produced new Marines in cycles that never stopped. Aircraft replaced losses so quickly that squadrons often returned to full strength within weeks. Casualties no longer threatened operational collapse. They activated replacement pipelines. Japanese intelligence observed many of these changes, but not all of their implications. In Japanese planning rooms, the American system was often interpreted through the lens of cynicism, a force driven by material abundance rather than spiritual resilience. This led to a dangerous underestimation of how organizational depth and psychological endurance could reinforce each other. Japanese commanders believed that once U.S. losses grew severe enough, even an industrial giant would hesitate. Tarawa would expose the flaw in that belief. When the first Marine waves were cut down in the lagoon, American commanders did not interpret the outcome as proof that the assault had failed. They interpreted it as confirmation that their casualty estimates were accurate. Reinforcement schedules did not waver. New units kept moving forward. Hesitation was treated as the true failure. As the battle developed, this difference in the collision between those two philosophies would unfold minute by minute across the coral flats and shattered seawalls of Tarawa. And with each successive wave that pressed forward after devastating loss, Japanese officers began to sense that their understanding of the enemy was fundamentally incomplete. They were about to witness something they had not planned for, an enemy that did not need to pause. Angle 1. The human reality. U.S. Marines advancing through losses that should have stopped any force. For the U.S. Marines who hit the beaches at Tarawa, shock arrived not as fear, but as immediacy. The lagoon swallowed landing craft. Men were forced into the water with full packs, rifles held overhead, stumbling forward through surf under direct fire. Machine guns raked the surface. Artillery shells burst in shallow water, throwing up pillars of spray and steel. Entire squads were cut down before they reached the sand. Yet the movement did not stop. Behind the first wave, another advanced, then another. Wounded Marines were dragged aside, while fresh units passed them without breaking stride. Officers fell. New leaders stepped forward instantly. The fight compressed into minutes, measured not by gain of ground, but by survival inside it. What shocked Japanese observers most was not the Marine casualties. It was the lack of visible hesitation afterward. Attacks did not pause to mourn. They did not consolidate after destruction. They resumed. The wounded were evacuated under covering fire, while riflemen pressed forward over the same blood-soaked ground seconds later. Even when entire platoons vanished inside kill zones, the assault continued without visible collapse. From the Marine perspective, this persistence was not born of recklessness. It was trained. Assault doctrine had conditioned them to expect devastation and to move anyway. The most dangerous moment was not the first charge. It was the pause after it. By the second day, entire Marine battalions had been reduced far below operational strength. Yet the attack continued. Fire teams reformed from survivors. Machine gun crews were rebuilt from volunteers pulled forward from rifle sections. What mattered was not perfect strength. It was presence. The battlefield became a place where loss no longer dictated action. And that reality created a form of psychological pressure the Japanese defenders had never encountered before. Angle 2. The Japanese command perspective. When catastrophic loss failed to produce psychological collapse. Inside Japanese command bunkers, early reports from the shoreline followed Iwate patterns. Severe enemy casualties, numerous landing craft destroyed, assault waves disrupted. By every principle of imperial operational thinking, this indicated success. But as hours passed, those assumptions began to unravel. Instead of silence after the destruction of the first attacks, new communications arrived reporting renewed enemy movement. Then more. Then continuous pressure. Observers watched fresh U.S. formations rising from the surf and advancing into defensive lines already saturated with fire. For Japanese officers trained to believe decisive shock ended assaults, this behavior was profoundly unsettling. They waited for the enemy to break.
The enemy did not break. By the second night, the Japanese garrison realized the assault was not slowing. It was accelerating. Marine artillery had been brought ashore. Tanks began appearing across the seawall. Positions that had held firmly against initial assault were now under pressure from multiple directions. Japanese command faced an operational contradiction. Their defenses had functioned exactly as designed. The enemy had suffered enormous losses, and yet that loss had failed to produce the expected operational paralysis. Instead, it had generated something more dangerous: replacement-driven momentum. This was not a failure of courage on the Japanese side. It was a failure of prediction. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese officers confronted the possibility that their core assumption, shock equals victory, no longer applied against this enemy. And that realization produced something far more destabilizing than surprise. It produced doubt. Angle 3. The technological pressure. Why firepower could not stop organizational momentum. Japanese defenses at Tarawa were formidable. Concrete bunkers were reinforced with steel. Coastal guns covered lagoon approaches. Mortars were pre-registered against landing zones. Machine gun nests interlocked in overlapping arcs. Firepower worked. But firepower alone could not resolve what unfolded. U.S. naval gunnery shattered visible defenses. Carrier aircraft struck repeatedly. Yet, even when bombardment destroyed emplacements, Japanese defenders continued to fight from secondary positions hidden beneath wreckage and sand. The island itself became a battlefield made of ruins. What shifted the balance was not a single technological advantage, but the layering of systems. American destroyers adjusted fire in minutes. Spotters corrected targets in real time. Tanks were landed despite reef obstacles and moved directly into the fight. Engineers cleared paths through barbed wire and concrete under covering fire. Japanese weapons killed continuously. American systems replaced continuously. This distinction proved decisive. Every Japanese emplacement that opened fire reveals itself to counter-battery response. Every Marine loss activated another replacement. Every destroyed vehicle triggered another landing. The Japanese garrison fought magnificently within its limits, but its limits were static. The American system was dynamic. Its center of gravity did not reside in any one weapon. It resided in continuity. And continuity could not be killed by bullets alone. By the end of the second day, the Japanese defenders found themselves fighting not an attack, but an advancing machine that absorbed everything thrown into it and moved forward regardless. The defensive formulas that had dominated Japanese planning could no longer keep pace with the battlefield unfolding around them. The shock they expected to impose on the enemy was now rebounding inward upon themselves. And with that reversal, the confrontation entered its most dangerous phase. Angle 4. Leadership under psychological strain. When Japanese generals lost predictive control. For Japanese generals observing the battle from command positions beyond Betio, the most alarming development was not the scale of American firepower. It was the failure of prediction. Their war planning had always depended on the ability to forecast how the enemy would behave once pushed beyond certain limits of loss. That predictive confidence now began to collapse. Early reports from Tarawa matched expectations. Devastating Marine casualties, stalled advances, broken landing waves. But within hours, a contradiction emerged. Despite the carnage, American pressure did not diminish. It intensified. Units that Japanese commanders believed destroyed reappeared in new formations. Positions labeled as sealed remained contested. Japanese headquarters attempted to impose order through updated assumptions. Perhaps the Americans would pause overnight. Perhaps they would regroup offshore. Perhaps the second day would bring hesitation. None of these expectations materialized. Instead, the assault resumed before dawn. This was the deepest form of shock for Japanese leadership. They had not simply misjudged enemy strength. They had misjudged enemy psychology. The belief that catastrophic loss produces paralysis was no longer reliable. The battlefield had entered a phase where enemy suffering did not translate into enemy retreat. For commanders trained to think in terms of decisive psychological moments, this produced a silent crisis of confidence. Tactical orders continued to flow. Defensive lines were adjusted. Counterattacks were planned. But beneath that surface activity, certainty eroded. Decision-making became reactive rather than predictive. Japanese leadership did not collapse in fear. It continued to direct the battle with discipline, but it no longer controlled the narrative arc of events. That narrative now belonged to an adversary who did not respond according to familiar rules. And once that control was lost, regaining it under fire became impossible. Angle 5. The moral warfare dimension. Why Japanese defenders could not break Marine persistence. On Betio's narrow strip of land, the fight unfolded as an exchange not only of bullets and shells, but of will. Japanese defenders fought with absolute commitment. Their positions were protected by concrete steel and mutually supporting fire. Retreat was not an option. Surrender was not considered. By every measure of courage and sacrifice, the defense was formidable. Yet the Marines continued advancing. This created a brutal psychological paradox. Japanese soldiers fought under a doctrine that revered death in defense of the emperor as the highest form of honor. They expected their own willingness to die to overwhelm opponents less prepared for such finality. But the Marine
Corporals and privates stepped forward without ceremony. When the attack faltered, artillery corrected the problem. When resistance stiffened, tanks were brought forward. There was no ritualized climax. There was only continuation. For Japanese defenders, this continuity of assault created a moral pressure they had not anticipated. The enemy's willingness to continue after catastrophic loss undermined the logic of self-sacrificial defense. Death no longer guaranteed deterrence. Even annihilation of entire assault units did not stop new ones from emerging. The result was not immediate despair, but accelerated exhaustion. Every defensive success felt fleeting. Positions that held during one engagement were attacked again within hours. The sense of holding ground through final sacrifice lost its strategic meaning when no pause followed. This drained the defender of the psychological payoff that doctrine had promised. The battlefield no longer rewarded heroic last stands with decisive outcome. It rewarded persistence. And persistence belonged to the side that could replace endlessly. Angle 6. The strategic misjudgment. When Japanese command underestimated American endurance. Beyond the tactical and psychological dimensions, Tarawa exposed a broader strategic miscalculation that echoed across the Pacific War. Japanese planners understood that the United States possessed superior industrial capacity. What they underestimated was how that capacity translated into sustained operational endurance under extreme human loss. Japanese strategic thinking often assumed that democratic societies were less tolerant of protracted suffering. It was believed that public opinion, shaken by heavy casualties, would restrain continued offensive operations. Tarawa tested that belief directly. The casualty lists were severe. The images of wounded Marines struggling ashore were stark. The fight was brutal and costly from the first hour. Yet, the American response was not withdrawal or hesitation. It was reinforcement. More ships arrived. More troops landed. More firepower was concentrated. The operational decision was not reversed. It was doubled. This revealed something Japanese planners had not fully integrated into their strategic models. American endurance was not only material. It was psychological, institutional, and political. The U.S. war system did not interpret heavy loss as evidence of failure. It interpreted it as evidence that further pressure was required.
This inversion of meaning shattered the assumption that shock could serve as a strategic deterrent. Tarawa was not simply a tactical battle. It was a demonstration that American warfare operated on a different logic, one that did not fracture under the weight of its own casualties, but instead reorganized and advanced. This realization would reshape Japanese defensive planning for the rest of the war. But at Tarawa, it arrived without remedy and without warning. The stage was now set for the battle's decisive turning point, not when loss was inflicted, but when loss failed to accomplish its intended effect. And in that failure, the moment of operational reversal began to crystallize. November 23, 1943. Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. Dawn broke across a battlefield that no longer resembled a beach. It was a landscape of shattered concrete, cratered sand, twisted metal, and bodies half buried by the tide. Smoke clung to the ground in slow-moving sheets. Fires still burned inside destroyed bunkers, their glow visible beneath collapsed roofs of reinforced concrete. For Japanese command, the night had been expected to bring relief. It had not. Instead of silence, the defenders heard engines. The sound grew louder as tanks moved from the shoreline into the heart of the island. American artillery, now firmly established on captured ground, opened fire with devastating rhythm. Shells fell not only on front-line positions, but on the interior of the Japanese defensive network itself. The Marines were no longer confined to the sand. They were inside the system. Japanese bunkers that had dominated the lagoon approaches now faced attack from their flanks and rear. Interlocking fields of fire, designed for outward defense, became liabilities. Emplacements that had crushed the first assault waves were assaulted from angles never intended in their construction. For Japanese commanders, the operational meaning of this moment was profound. The enemy had not merely recovered from catastrophic loss. The enemy had transformed loss into positional dominance. Marine units advanced in short, violent bursts. Tank guns smashed through bunker walls at point-blank range. Demolition teams crawled through smoke and debris to place charges against firing slits. Flamethrower crews advanced into corridors where no infantry could survive unassisted. Each strong point fell not through grand maneuver, but through relentless reduction. The Japanese defenders fought with unimaginable determination. Positions were held until they were physically erased. Gun crews fired until buried beneath collapsing concrete. Mortar teams continued operating even as surrounding emplacements vanished. But what had once been a mutually supporting system now became isolated points of resistance being eliminated one by one. By mid-morning, Japanese command faced a reality it had not anticipated. The American assault had not reset after losses. It had restructured. New axes of advance appeared where none had been planned by the defenders. Tanks crushed through obstacles once thought impossible. Infantry units leapfrogged forward behind direct fire support. The battlefield compressed as gaps between Marine spearheads disappeared. Communications inside the Japanese garrison frayed. Reports from frontline units arrived late or not at all. Observers watching sectors they believed secured suddenly reported enemy movement from behind. Defensive coordination deteriorated not from cowardice, but from the physical disintegration of the network that had allowed command to see and control the fight. Japanese attempts at localized counterattack met overwhelming response. When small units surged forward in desperate efforts to close breaches, they encountered artillery strikes pre-registered within minutes. Machine gun fire returned with crushing weight. The Marines did not pause to consolidate. They absorbed each counterstrike and continued pressing forward. This was not a battle of advances and retreats anymore. It was a battle of compression. American forces did not seek sweeping maneuver across the island. The island was too small for that. Instead, they advanced by consuming space.
meter by meter, bunker by bunker, position by position. Every gain reduced the capacity of the Japanese defense to function as a coherent whole. For Japanese generals monitoring the operation beyond Berryo, the meaning of these developments unfolded with creeping disbelief. By every measure of traditional doctrine, the assault should have stalled under its own casualties. Instead, it was strengthening with time. Firepower increased, coordination improved, pressure intensified. The pattern was unmistakable. Loss had not slowed the enemy. Loss had activated the enemy. And as the second day of the battle crossed into afternoon, Japanese command reached the first stage of a realization that would echo far beyond Tarawa. They were no longer fighting an assault that could be stopped by destruction alone. They were facing a system designed to metabolize destruction into forward motion. What remained now was the question of how long their defenses could endure against an opponent that no longer needed to pause. November 23, 1943. The final break on Berryo. By the afternoon of the second day, the battle on Tarawa had entered its terminal phase. What remained of the Japanese defensive grid no longer functioned as a system. It existed as scattered pockets of resistance, individual bunkers, trench segments, and rubble-filled positions separated by Marine-controlled ground. American pressure did not slacken. Fresh units rotated forward even as exhausted companies were pulled back to reorganize. Artillery fired in short, precise missions directed by forward observers now operating deep inside the island. Tanks moved in pairs, one firing while the other advanced. Flame teams followed closely behind assault squads. The attack had become a machine of coordinated reduction. Japanese defenders fought with unimaginable determination. Positions were held until they were physically entombed beneath collapsed concrete. Gun crews fired until buried beneath collapsing concrete. Mortar teams continued operating even as surrounding emplacements vanished. But what had once been a mutually supporting system now became isolated points of resistance being eliminated one by one. By mid-morning, Japanese command faced a reality it had not anticipated. The American assault had not reset after losses. It had restructured. New axes of advance appeared where none had been planned by the defenders. Tanks crushed through obstacles once thought impossible.
Small Japanese units surged forward in pre-dawn assaults. American artillery responded within moments. Machine gun fire shredded movement across open ground. Tanks sealed breaches as soon as they appeared. The defenders now faced an enemy that not only attacked again after loss, but adapted faster after each exchange. By the early hours of November 24, organized Japanese resistance on Berryo had effectively ceased to exist. Fighting continued in scattered pockets, isolated groups refusing surrender, firing from rubble, emerging from concealed tunnels to strike and vanish. But the island as a defensive system was finished. For Japanese generals observing the end of the battle, the outcome was not merely defeat, it was incomprehension. They had expected that the annihilation of the first assault waves would determine the outcome. Instead, it had become only the opening chapter. The inability to halt the Marines through catastrophic loss represented a fundamental rupture in imperial operational thinking. The attacker had not recoiled, it had intensified. Japanese losses were near total. Of the more than 4,500 defenders on Berryo, only a handful survived the battle. The garrison had fought essentially to the last man. Yet their sacrifice had not produced the strategic effect anticipated. The Americans now held the island. The central defensive node guarding the marshals had been cracked. For the U.S. Marines, the cost was staggering. Over 1,000 killed, more than 2,000 wounded in 76 hours of fighting. Entire units were reduced to fractions of their original strength. Yet the assault had not failed. It had succeeded precisely because it never paused long enough for failure to take shape. This was the moment Japanese command had not foreseen. Not the moment when defenders broke, but the moment when attackers did not. Across the Pacific, this realization struck with quiet force. The doctrine that loss produced hesitation no longer governed the battlefield. The Americans had demonstrated that shock could be endured, reorganized, and transformed into deeper penetration. From this point forward, every Japanese defensive plan had to be reconsidered under a new and terrifying assumption. The enemy could be devastated and still advance. As the smoke lifted from Betio and the last resistance flickered out in ruined bunkers, the meaning of Tarawa extended far beyond its coral shoreline. It was no longer a battle over a small island. It was the moment the Pacific War crossed into a phase where attrition no longer guaranteed delay. And what followed would reshape every island defense Japan would construct from that point onward. When the last organized resistance on Betio finally faded, the battlefield revealed the full weight of what had unfolded. The coral sand was churned into gray mud. Concrete bunkers lay crushed inward, their firing slits ripped open by tank guns and demolition charges. The lagoon was still dotted with wrecked landing craft, their metal frames twisted by artillery and surf. The cost of the assault was written across every meter of ground. For the U.S. Marine Corps, Tarawa became an immediate and painful reckoning. The casualty totals stunned even seasoned commanders. More than 1,000 Marines and sailors were dead. Thousands more were wounded. Entire assault units had been reduced to shadows of their original strength. Yet the island had been taken in barely 3 days. The brutal arithmetic of the battle forced American leadership to confront a hard truth. Amphibious victories in the Central Pacific would be bought with blood on a scale rarely seen before. Within days, the Marine Corps began to dissect every phase of the landing. Tide calculations were re-examined. Amphibious vehicle design gained urgency. Naval bombardment doctrine was revised to emphasize longer and more concentrated preparatory fire. Joint coordination between Navy, Marine, and air units was tightened to reduce the exposure of initial waves. Tarawa became not just a victory, but a lesson engraved in loss. For Japanese command, the aftermath carried a different weight. The garrison at Betio had fulfilled its orders with absolute finality. Nearly all of its defenders had died at their posts. Yet their annihilation had not halted the American advance. The strategic effect Japanese planners had expected, the shock that would force hesitation or pause, never materialized. Instead, the fall of Tarawa became a demonstration that even total sacrifice could fail to delay the enemy in a meaningful way. Reports circulated through Japanese headquarters describing how Marines attacked again after devastating casualties, how tanks moved inland despite obstacles thought impassable, how assaults intensified rather than weakened with time. These reports undermined assumptions that had guided Pacific defense planning for years. Japanese high command now faced an unsettling reality. Their island fortresses could be destroyed through relentless pressure. Their garrisons could fight to extinction, and still the enemy would move forward without stopping. The immediate strategic consequences followed quickly. With Tarawa secured, the United States gained a critical forward base in the Central Pacific. Airfields could now be constructed within range of the Marshall Islands. Supply lines shortened. Carrier task forces received new staging points. Each logistical step forward multiplied the speed of the next operation. Within weeks, American forces launched new assaults deeper into Japanese-held territory. For Japanese planners, Tarawa forced a reassessment of what delay actually meant. Defensive lines could no longer be measured in how long they held under fire, only in how many American resources they consumed before collapse. The idea that one island could decisively blunt the enemy's will was gone. Yet even as doctrine began to shift, the psychological damage lingered. The belief that overwhelming initial casualties shattered an attacker's resolve had been a cornerstone of Japanese military thinking. Tarawa disproved it in the most direct way possible. The enemy had absorbed unimaginable losses and returned with even greater force. And as both sides prepared for the next stage of the Pacific campaign, the shadow of Betio stretched far beyond its shattered reef. In the weeks following the fall of Tarawa, its meaning traveled far beyond the wreckage of Betio. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders began rewriting their assumptions about how long American assaults could be delayed and at what cost. The idea that catastrophic casualties would force operational hesitation had been disproven in the most unforgiving way possible. The U.S. advance did not slow. Within 2 months, American forces struck the Marshall Islands, overwhelming Japanese defenses at Kwajalein and Eniwetok with a speed that stunned observers on both sides. Amphibious operations now unfolded with improved coordination, deeper naval gunfire preparation, and more effective use of armored vehicles brought ashore. The lessons of Tarawa were applied immediately and ruthlessly. For Japanese defensive planners, this acceleration created an impossible dilemma. If their garrisons fought to annihilation, the enemy still advanced. If they conserved forces, the enemy advanced even faster. Island defense doctrine shifted from the concept of destroying the enemy at the shoreline to fighting a battle of depth, attrition, and time. Defenses were pulled inland, tunnels were expanded, cave networks were carved into volcanic ridges. The battlefield was reimagined as a labyrinth designed to prolong resistance rather than prevent landing. These changes would shape the brutal fighting at Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But they also reflected a deeper admission: the United States could no longer be stopped at the water's edge. For the Marines, Tarawa became both a symbol of sacrifice and a blueprint for future operations. Units rebuilt with replacements trained under new doctrine. Amphibious vehicles were produced in greater numbers. Combat engineers were integrated more deeply into assault formations. Firepower was layered with increasing density at every level of attack. The war became faster, the scale became larger, and the cost, if anything, grew even heavier. Inside Japan, the implications were equally severe. Tarawa was not merely reported as a defeat, it was discussed as a warning. The enemy had shown that blood alone could not slow him. The psychological distance between the Pacific perimeter and the Japanese homeland began to collapse. What had once felt like distant battle now felt like an approaching certainty. Yet even as preparations intensified, a fundamental imbalance remained unchanged. The United States could replace men, ships, aircraft, and ammunition without pause. Japan could not. Each island lost reduced the strategic depth of the empire. Each garrison destroyed diminished a force that could not be replenished at the same rate. Time, which Japanese doctrine once sought to steal from the enemy, now worked relentlessly against them. For Japanese generals, the stunned realization born at Tarawa matured into grim acceptance over the following year. The enemy's persistence could not be broken through sacrifice alone. Defensive brilliance could still impose heavy losses, but it could.
They attacked again because their system made stopping unnecessary. And with that understanding, the Pacific War entered its most violent and inescapable phase, one defined not by hesitation after loss, but by momentum fed by relentless continuity. As the front lines marched steadily westward across the ocean, the shock that first unsettled Japanese command at Betio became the new normal. The enemy would keep coming. Tarawa was a small island, barely 2 miles long. Yet its meaning stretched across the entire Pacific War. What unfolded on that strip of coral in November 1943 was not simply a brutal amphibious victory. It was the moment when two completely different understandings of war collided, and only one proved capable of surviving modern industrial conflict. Japanese command had believed with unshakable certainty that overwhelming loss would fracture any attacker's will. That belief had shaped fortresses, doctrine, and sacrifice across the Pacific perimeter. At Tarawa, that belief met an enemy whose entire system was built around the opposite idea, that loss was not a stopping point, but a condition to be overcome through replacement, coordination, and continuity. The Marines who advanced again after devastation were not immune to fear. They were not untouched by loss. They carried those losses forward with them. What made Tarawa different was that the American war machine did not allow devastation to translate into hesitation. Where Japanese doctrine sought to break momentum through suffering, American doctrine absorbed suffering and turned it into forward motion. For Japanese generals, the shock was not simply tactical, it was existential. The idea that the enemy could be shattered at the shoreline and still advance shattered something deeper: the confidence that sacrifice at scale guaranteed strategic effect. From this point onward, every island defense would be built under the shadow of that realization. For the Marine Corps, Tarawa became a scar that reshaped everything that followed. New landing craft, heavier bombardments, deeper coordination, and more layered assaults were all forged from the blood paid on Betio. The lessons were not theoretical. They were earned at the cost of lives that could never be replaced. And for the Pacific War itself, Tarawa marked a transition. The campaign stopped being about whether the United States could push westward. It became about how far that push would go, and at what cost to both sides. In the end, what stunned Japanese command was not merely that the Marines attacked again. It was that they attacked again after the unthinkable had already happened, and that nothing, not loss, not fire, not sacrifice, could persuade them to stop. That realization would echo across every island yet to fall.